Okay. So okay. So maybe just to have a little moment of warm up, it would be great if you could introduce yourself. I can start. My name is Arkadiusz Półtorak. I work at the Jagiellonian University in the Department of Performativity and Performance Studies. And here at UKRAiNATV and the Stream Art Studio, I am a recurring guest. And today I have a great pleasure of introducing Maria Teresa Alves. Could you maybe say a few words about yourself?
Sure. I'm Maria Teresa Alves. I'm an artist, and I'm living in Europe for many years.
We invited you to come to the studio, and unfortunately this talk is a sort of an ersatz situation. Unfortunately, Maria Teresa could not appear in Kraków for a workshop we've been planning, a workshop which deals with the appropriation of the heritage of local cultures. And by local culture specifically, we meant this time the culture of Górale Karpaccy, Huculi, within the larger dispositives of nation state and nationally oriented cultures and ideologies. And I invited you to come here to the studio and talk about these issues because of your previous experience of organizing workshops, workshops which, as far as I'm concerned, were mainly addressed to the members of indigenous communities in Brazil, and whose aim was to deal with similar appropriation in that context, charged by the politics, the cultural and identity politics of colonization. Could you, at the very beginning, maybe tell us a little bit about these workshops you've been organizing? I mean here specifically the workshop Decolonizing Brazil, but this was only one among many similar endeavors.
Sure. I think I would like to concentrate on decolonizing Brazil because a few days ago I just again met with the students, and in the month of October, some of the students I invited to participate in a workshop I was not giving, but I was also in a workshop, and so we were living together in the same house for a week. So it's an ongoing relationship with these students. This workshop began because I was invited to do a new commissioned work by the Festas Triennale in the city of Sorocaba, in the state of São Paulo, and I was looking at indigenous histories in the city, and there was very little of it, and I decided to work with ceramics. And I will not explain that work. You can just look it up in my website. And part of the possibilities of the project was a workshop with university students. I requested the indigenous university students. And at the end of the workshop, the students asked me if I could come back and they would like to do a book. Because my workshop had been presentations on different renowned thinkers indigenous thinkers of different parts of the Americas who are academically respected, and such was not the case in Brazil at the time that we did this workshop. And the students say, well, we would like to talk about important activists that are never written about, or important leaders, or thinkers of our communities, and so we would like a book. And so I went to SESC, which is this amazing cultural institution in Brazil. It's a private institution, and they had funded the Frestes Triennale and had said that they very much appreciated my work, and if I ever wanted to continue doing a project in their city, they would be interested in hearing a proposal. So for the first time, I used my little fame to make a proposal for the students, and we were very humble in our demands, let us say. And there was somebody working in the production, and she thought we were too humble, and added a whole bunch of other materials and other possibilities for the students. So it was a very joyous celebration because we ended up getting everything on that list. And so we could really do an amazing job. What was important was the total support of a cultural institution, the financial support. I agreed that if they funded the project, I would not receive any payment for 1 month of work. And then I would also give a workshop for non-Indigenous people for SESC. They provided a producer, transportation, materials, very much different materials that we requested, and a cook. And this was really important. It's the first time I had this experience, but a cook was important because the students were from areas that are accustomed to eating fish and much vegetables. And the São Paulo state is very much, let's say, cowboy country. It's hardcore meat, very little vegetables, and this is problematic in their day-to-day existence. So we had a cook who made what we wanted to eat, and it helped us a lot. We started out by the students' request of a book. They started to write essays on different peoples they thought were important in their regions. Many came from the Amazon. They're studying in São Paulo because it was less racist to study in the south than in the north. That's why there's so many young people from the Amazon there. During their whole school period of 4 years, 5 years, most of them never return home because it's very expensive to travel. And so they live on campus full time, a very difficult situation because it's far from town in a small little town. The students also, during our time together, brought up the quotidian racism they confront on the campus, in the health clinics and restaurants and the day-to-day lives. And you asked about tactics. And I usually don't go into these situations very clearly aware of what will I be doing. I have had many things I've done in life, so I hope that those situations are inside of me and are ready to work to the benefit of the situation. So when the students said about the quotidian racism, I thought if we did a performative workshop based on Augusto Boal's guerrilla theater, that it might be helpful. So I had gone to 2 workshops by Augusto Boal while he was alive, and we started to experiment a little bit with that, but it went off in their own directions in response to the needs of the students. And I discovered that these performative actions were very important because it put out very lonely situations where the students were confronted by themselves to very racist situations, and they tried to react as best they could, that they thought was appropriate. And if you make a performance of it, we are all witnesses, and we can be with the student and be supportive of the student. Yes, it's after the fact, but it was a relief. And I have had many racist situations also, and I said, oh, this would have been so wonderful if I could have reenacted it and just people afterwards come and talk to me and give me courage for the future. So this was something that happened a bit spontaneously. Then the students said that there's no indigenous languages being taught at their university. although there are several European languages taught. And there were around, I don't know, 10 languages spoken by the students at the time, indigenous languages. It's a beautiful treasure, and the university just didn't care. So I said, okay, why don't we make little booklets about basic communication in your language. So booklets were made, and then for the end of the month, all of this was presented at SASKI in their exhibition space. So we were also given many tablets. The students had requested one, and we were given, I think, 11. So in each tablet, we put one booklet, and it was interactive, so the people visiting SASKI, the cultural center, could learn a language. We were also, one of the producers just spontaneously put on our list of demands, sound studio time. The students went there and they heard their voices, their indigenous languages aloud in a space. And that was an astounding experience. And then we got some speakers and we put it throughout the building of SASKI. There's a dental clinic, we put it outside the dental clinic, we put it outside the street, the entranceway of SASKI, and it was different indigenous languages being spoken aloud. And this was amazing. Maybe 500 years that this doesn't happen on that land base there. There was also, what was amazing was the students, many of them had learned Portuguese quite recently. There was one student which Portuguese was his 7th language, because he had learned 6 other indigenous languages first, and they made brave efforts to make essays, beautiful essays on activists and local intellectuals. We also went to Flona, which was a natural reserve park, and there was very interesting because there were guides that can take you through the park, and there was a division. There was a group of progressive guides and a group of, let's say, traditional state narrative thinkers, as we say. And the progressive guides wanted to change the name of the trail that goes through the park, which is an original indigenous trail, to the Tupiniquim Trail, whereas the older guides wanted to keep the name of a European person who had enslaved indigenous people and had made a metalworks. And so we did a performative action that I said was an artwork. So we wrote on cloth to Tupiniquim Trail, and we just tied it along trees along the way. And then I explained to the park that as this was an artwork, it could not be taken down. So it would have to just kind of fall apart on its own. I don't know if they respected it or not, but that was a tactic. Then while we were in the park, there was a situation of racism, and this is to show how one has to just be ready to respond with all that one has. So the students were extremely nervous, and the group that we would have to pass through was a very, very large group, much larger than us. And I had to think of a way to make them pass safely. And all of a sudden, I remembered reading Caesar's war diaries, which I had to read in Latin class, in Latin. And I remember hating and wanting to know, why did I need to read war diaries? But I remember one lesson, one chapter on making a phalanx to go inside a situation to break up an army. So you make a phalanx and then you push in to break up the army. And so then I thought, okay, we put all the older people in the group on the outside and the less indigenous looking people in the group on the outside. And I had an assistant who was very Germanic looking. And I said, you will be on the front because you have blonde hair and light eyes. And you're the only one that can get us through here. And so we did a phalanx and we got all the students through safely. So it's just, I always feel that I can only arrive with myself and respond to what is needed at that time, hoping that I have developed enough skills in life to be able to reach the necessities of the situation. So in this workshop, I think it worked out very well. And it was just responding, and also every night finishing at 8 o'clock, going home, and then thinking with my assistant until midnight about the things that were done that worked the best, what didn't quite work as well as we thought it could have. What do we do tomorrow with the issues that the students brought to us that day that needed to have a support structure for them to continue as students with good energies in life. So it was very much what would be called in Brazil, I think, a response and call situation where a call is made and you respond to the best of your abilities to the necessity of that time.
You've mentioned that you were driven from the very beginning to also include some material practices. You mentioned ceramics specifically. Why was that engagement with the material practice? Why is it important in your practice or in the workshops you engage in? What kind of film does it provide for this feedback system that is being built, I guess, from the 0 point anew with every opportunity to work together with other people?
We didn't use ceramics directly in the workshop, but I had used it in the work I had made during the first workshop with the students. But it was a part. I had asked for ceramic vases to be made as a testimony to the indigenous history of the area. And then I put them in many places in the city where the non-indigenous go and frequent, like a jogging lane, the theater, a school, a monument. So I put them there to mark an indigenous land base. And then the students saw these ceramics and they said, could we have some in our university? So I had made a list of places in the city. And when they asked that, I thought it was very important to listen to their request. So then I took ones away from the city and we went to the university and asked where they would want it. And we had a team to help place them. And they said, we want it where it will be very visible, where lots of students will see it. So in the cafeteria, at the exact entrance of the university. So they wanted to make a statement of visibility. And also when the workshop was carried out, when we had done these writings on the trail and tied it to a tree, the students themselves later wrote their ethnic group on a piece of leftover cloth and went and tied it all over the university to make a visibility. After the show finished, the Triennale, I asked that all the ceramics be gathered that were in the city and given as a gift to the Indigenous Students Association, which is called CCI. And then they then took them out and then distribute them even more. So before it was in the entrance, but past the guard of the university. And when I came back, they had one right in front of the guard. So it was taking over more and more visible space, and the ceramics helped them do that. And it was a wonderful situation that came out by accident.
I am asking about these material practices because when we started preparing for the prospective workshop in Kraków, you asked specifically to bring some examples of material and visual culture from the local, present and historical communities in Karpaty, as again certain potential foils to approach the clash or the tension between what you called the state narrative and the local, or if you will, indigenous narrative or indigenous ways of thinking. Maybe local is a more appropriate word in this context, although that's, I guess, up for debate. And out of the material I suggested, I brought up, which was largely made up of some objects from the collection of the local ethnographic museum, which now puts a lot of work into reframing whatever is there of the heritage of the Hutzul or Lemko people. This included Easter eggs. This included fabrics, which are, I think, a very good foil for discussion, because now many motifs from the traditional Hutzul culture are reappropriated in the metropolitan bourgeois culture in Poland as something trendy, something to show off in a living room, say. But in the end, what drew your attention were the postcards and paintings, which were depicting a very much stereotypical outlook on the Hutzul culture in the beginning of the 20th or even late 19th century. Why did this source material draw your attention in particular?
Earlier, we had briefly mentioned the different situations that are happening in the world right now that feel like urgent priorities. And I agree with that. And I also see from Brazil, because I'm here now for since the beginning of October, no, end of mid-September, and I'm meeting with students and other situations, and I see that these paintings and then the postcards are very similar to situations that continue in Brazil visually, that even though they are of a past that was appropriated and incorporated into the national narrative for whatever purposes the states decide, and they change all the time, but it's always for the state, leave very real problems, quotidian problems in the present, that communities end up having to expend a lot of energy to try to deconstruct as best as can be deconstructed, that cause many internal problems in a community. Energies of activists have to be sidetracked into resolving these discourses, which were not made by the community, but were made by the dominating culture. In the midst of, for example, right now in Brazil, it's very important, certain legislation on land demarcation. And this is where all the energies are very urgently needed. And at the same time, there is this constant situation of authenticity, which in part is caused by the icons, the images that were made since the beginning of colonization in Brazil, that remain in the minds of the local non-indigenous, which affects which activist is going to be listened to. How, within this iconography, how authentic do they measure up to these images? No? And so there is this constant situation still ongoing, resulting from these, what one might think, oh, innocent paintings. They were just paintings of people. But very much in that wonderful text you gave me to read by Agnieszka Janowska.
Agnieszka Jankowska, yes, Jankowska-Marzec.
Yeah, was very well detailed on the creation of types in the painting, and therefore mass distribution in postcards. And that also I appreciated very much that section on where the Hutzol painters afterwards were using themselves this type of imagery and then being criticized for using this, while the community is still in the process of trying to deconstruct these imageries. So that was my interest in paintings and postcards, because they still stay in our minds. In Brazil, it's still very much, for example, just 2 weeks ago, someone turned around to me, a non-Indigenous person, because I was having a technical problem with my phone, and I asked one of my students to help. And she very strangely said, oh, an Indigenous person using a phone. And I was very shocked that that still is part of a very archaic idea of Brazilians, of Indigenous peoples. And I said, look, it's just a question always of generation and access, you know? My mother can't deal with the phone, you know, and I can deal better with it, and this student can deal much better with it. It's just a question of generations. But it is stuck in the Brazilian mind, the imagery that was produced in the 16th century, the 17th century, the 18th and the 19th century. It is stuck, and it keeps reproducing in the same type of the stereotypes that Agnieszka spoke about in the Hutzul, gendered stereotypes of how a woman is of that population, the woman, how the man is, which causes further problems because it is an interpretation in Brazil, a European interpretation about very complex systems that are not the same gender systems as a European system. And then entire communities have to then deconstruct this gender situation that was made. And so I think through paintings is a very clear way that one sees how it progresses or stays the same, and how it accumulates in our minds, because we can see that in our minds. When we close our eyes, we see these iconic paintings. There was a mention of a painting of greeting of the Hutzol, greeting of the sun. And I have just seen last week in a museum here in Brazil, a similar situation of one indigenous group greeting the sun. You know, so there is these constructions there here in Europe and then here in Brazil, the same type of stereotyping of peoples to then place them in outside of participation in society. Also the whole culture, nature, making believe that there's a culture, making believe that there's a nature, is forever causing problems in how we are trying to be as a society today.
To digress for a moment from the Hutzul paintings or postcards themselves, you mentioned in the beginning that you also worked during your workshops with non-indigenous groups. Did this dynamic of stereotypical thinking and expecting a certain manifestation of authenticity, was it also at play in these workshops of yours? And if so, how did it surface?
The workshops were different. They would surface rarely, because I wasn't doing that kind of a workshop with the non-indigenous, because I didn't want to put my energy in Brazil on these kinds of issues. because there's so much to do with opening up spaces for indigenous young thinkers that as a working artist and a working designer, and I have other responsibilities, I try to focus the energy I have in that time frames for the indigenous students. So
I am asking maybe as a bridge to yet another question or yet another thought, because here at the Stream Art Studio, we often find ourselves trapped in a web of conflicted expectations, so to speak. And many of them actually stem from the fact that we still abide to certain state-driven narratives, especially now that we're still in a time of war, and the state narratives are mobilized in order to well, keep up the spirits of people who are engaged in fighting for their small and bigger motherlands, so to speak. And this often entices a lot of tensions, a lot of conflicts. And our idea to start or to focus on what is local, what maybe nears the indigenous in a way, and what, as it happens, was emerging for years at the very crossroads, at the border between today's Poland and today's Ukraine. In a sense, I think we were looking for some third space to look at our tensions, at our state narratives, and how these clash in the everyday, or as you said, quotidian situations. And this begs a question: what are the possible tactics of deconstructing, of working with such representations as the Hucul paintings of, say, Aksentowicz or Fryderyk Pauch, to kind of scrap this surface layer of the state narratives and maybe delve a little bit deeper? What can we do now, in your opinion, with such representatives to build a better interface for an intergenerational, cross, national, cross-ethnic conversation?
These are, in Brazil right now, this workshop I participated in with very well-meaning, wonderful human beings. They thought to make a space for the indigenous students by asking them to speak publicly in their languages, without taking into consideration the history of physical and cultural genocide. Therefore, one of the students spent a sleepless night because his ethnicity was one of the ones whose language got very much destroyed through this cultural genocide. And I was quite surprised that the organizers, who were all highly academic people, were not aware of this situation. And caused stress, very much distress to the young student. And in before he gave his presentation, I did mention this, the destruction of indigenous languages in Brazil, but by then it was too late because he had a hard night in the house. I think there are many problems in uniting the situation because for us, for example, there is the situation of 500 years of attempts to annihilate the indigenous, so that it is so inbred, the high levels of racism So we have indigenous people making believe that they're not indigenous. I have indigenous members of my family who make believe they're black, and very much shame. So I think right now in Brazil there is a beginning of, there is a beginning of inclusion, but it is an inclusion that's based on a concept of universality. And there is still not an understanding of not understanding, of being with complete different systems of thinking and moving around in the world. So for example, one very simple situation, the students are in a group situation to look at some graphic design elements on a table. And all the non-Indigenous students, they go immediately to the table and take over the space. And all the Indigenous students stay in the back, because you would not be aggressive in this situation. You would make space for everyone. So I spent my time in the workshop, saying, excuse me, can this person come a little closer? Can you give me a little space so this person can see what the drawing is on the table? We were at a very basic level, and also the students are used to raising their voice when they want to answer a question. And it is considered in some societies extremely impolite to take over a discourse, not letting everyone feel comfortable to speak at their own pace. So then when you are having all these situations in a group, and I've seen this many times, I've seen it when the Zapatistas went through Mexico on their march from Chiapas to Mexico City decades ago. I was present at one of their coming into a city. And what happened was I got there very early, and when the Zapatistas came in, all the non-Indigenous pressed forward and took over all the front positions, and all the Indigenous people ended up in the back. And these are different ways of being that are never being addressed as a basic problem in talking. How one is looking at each other or not looking at each other in the eye. I've already done a work about this based on my father's not looking in the eye, a European, and they have problems with that. So we need to figure out ways of figuring out how we can address these things. But the meeting in itself is extremely problematic, because our physicality, our way of looking at each other, our way of using our tone of voice is in conflict with other ways of being. And this will cause disruptions and places and possibilities of people to engage. So I think to address this has to be done beforehand, so that then meetings can be held, that people can be heard, and to understand that there's different ways of speaking that are not going to be set up in the way that a typical Zoom meeting is set up. It's just not going to work in a community context. And that I think the visual helps a lot, that people can talk about something physical, about a basket that they made, or a piece of ceramic that they made, or a piece of embroidery or cloth that they made. And it brings a whole process of the land to the space, because ceramics, of course, you go and get the earth, the clay, you have to prepare it. Each earth has different qualities. The making of the cloth, depending on whatever is the material, has different ways of working with it. The baskets, the different materials used, the different ways to cut it, different ways to bend it. When do you cut it? Do you cut it in a full moon? Do you not cut it in a full moon? Why do you cut it in a full moon or not cut it in a full moon? And these pieces of knowledge, I think, with the materiality, make space to discuss other things, because it opens up situations that we, especially in the context most of us have been raised in, are so far removed from the physical process of the things we put on ourselves, that I think the materiality brings us back to land, no? And this might be a way to start in a position where there is no universality.
You've mentioned in passing that in your workshops, these sort of discussions, performative practices and material practices gave way to certain interventions in already existing institutional contexts. What is the value of such interventions, in your opinion? And is this, in a way, the goal we should maybe have in mind while doing such workshops, while trying to basically sit by a common table in a different way than the dominant hegemonic cultures maybe tell us to sit around the table? Or maybe this is a speculative question and maybe a way to an open ending. Maybe interventions are just, maybe they happen, but what we should have in mind is building some new institutional structures from bottom up.
Okay, with that, the most amazing experience I had in a workshop was during the workshop I did. That was a work. It was 3 posters for the São Paulo Biennale in 2016. And I met with 3 different communities, and I said, this was 2016 when indigenous activists and intellectuals were not being invited to any conferences unless it had to do with land rights, or an indigenous writer was not being asked to contribute unless it had to do with children's stories. So I said, if you were invited to any conference, what would that conference be? What conference would you like to be invited? Because in 2016, this was not happening in Brazil. And what would you like to speak on? Just completely open. It didn't have to be on what they were studying, nothing. Just like we would all as a group invent a conference, and each person would make their own talk on different things that they were interested in looking at, either about their community or about non-indigenous community. And I was in one area that the local university did not agree to give us a room to do the workshop in. And so that part of the work was that we would do the poster with everybody's name and their and their talk, the name of the conference, and then the place that the conference was held, and the sponsors of the conference, as normally happens in these things. But all this was make-believe, and then we would predate it. So it would be put in the towns and in the universities where the workshops happen with a date that was previous to when it was put up. So it happened and nobody noticed, and now these indigenous thinkers are lecturers in this issue. There was an idea to jump over this very hard stupidity that we had of a total blockage of indigenous thinkers being accepted and part of normal conferences. So when we were not given a space in the university, I said, now what do we do here? We're supposed to put a university, but this university didn't do anything for us and actually said no, just to lend us a room for a few hours for one day. And one person, I think her name was Rosinete, a young Guarani student, said, well, why don't we just make up a university? And so this was beautiful. So a university was founded on the reservation, and then we had to make up, and then we we started putting sponsors' name of different organization, indigenous organization that exist. And then somebody said, but we can make up other sponsorships, you know? So there was the Indigenous Warrior Women's Association, the Postdoc Association, and there were very few postdoc Indigenous students, so to have an association was amazing. There was the Tupai Liberation Front of Guarani lands. So people just started putting out all their desires of associations that could fight the situations, the heavy-duty political situations. And this was beautiful. And this I could then take to the next workshop. And then we came up, the group there came up with the the Indigenous Art Critics Association. And at that time, there were no Indigenous art critics, but the desire made the possibility of existing. The desire made the possibility of existing, just liberated us in our thinking. We said, yes, we don't have to agree to this situation that we have now. And then an elderly woman who was the daughter of Tupai, and an important activist, was assassinated in 1983. He was my mentor in 1980. She said, Maria Teresa, we have to figure out how to apply the system to land struggles. And this I don't know how to do, but so in these workshops, by working together, there is the possibility for the decolonizing of the imagination. And I think this is what we need. I always read about decolonizing the imagination. I could not figure out how to do it. And then this one person, by saying, let's make our own federal university, even if it's just a few words on paper, just opened up the possibilities. Because when you open up the possibilities, yes, then you can have, in the near future, an association of indigenous scientists, which had never existed in Brazil. All of these become possible. And then several years ago, I did a work called Iracema de Castamber, and it was a fictive work about an indigenous woman who inherits a huge amount of money, long story, and makes an institution of art and science. And then the principal actor has now made an institution of culture. So I think what I have learned is that if you can say out in the world these desires you have in a way that can free you, then there is a possibility to make it viable, because it becomes visible and it becomes not a normality, but it becomes something that one can physically aspire to. Whereas if you don't say it, it is always internal to one person, and as a group, you cannot aspire to it, you know? So, and this was this wonderful group of women in Mato Grosso that liberated all of us into being able to think about a different future. That's now happening. It's now happening, so.
Well, thank you, Maria Teresa. And I think this conversation is already nearing 1 hour, which is much longer than I planned for, and I don't want to keep you online for too long and speaking for too long. So thank you very much for this talk.
Okay.
And
thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Okay.
Dla mnie to są takie dwie kategorie historyczne. O, już się widzę. Słuchajcie, przepraszam. To jest właśnie taki moment, kiedy skończył się wywiad, a właściwie z perspektywy wizualnej był to monolog wizualny i wywiad i dialog audiowizualny, który nam się zapisał. Maria Teresa Alves w rozmowie z Arkadiuszem Półtorakiem stanowi taki wstęp do tego, że do dowodu na to, że jesteśmy na żywo, że tutaj sobie lokalnie pracujemy, dyskutujemy i my chyba zostaniemy w tej formule lokalnej. Ja wyskoczyłem w tym momencie z mikrofonem, żeby przywitać się, a jednocześnie pożegnać z osobami, które są z nami ewentualnie hybrydowo, bo myśmy to zapowiadali jako taką formułę. Więc jeżeli te osoby są gdzieś tutaj niedaleko, to zapraszamy do nas, bo dyskusja jest intensywna, wątki zbieramy, a proces będziemy, zakładam, kontynuować, bo będziemy go kontynuować i o tym też będziemy rozmawiać nie tylko w formie dzisiejszego spotkania i takiego trochę, no powiedziałbym, nieformalnego póki co warsztatu dla nas samych, ale też mam nadzieję w formule długoterminowego programu badawczego, w którego takich dosyć sporych i otwartych ramach będziemy już niedługo od początku przyszłego roku pracować jako studio, jako UKRAiNATV, zapraszać gościnnie, gości, osoby współpracujące i wypracowywać sobie przynajmniej kilka takich wątków, które gdzieś tam w ciągu kolejnych 2, a nawet 3 lat się będą ze sobą łączyć, czasem dzielić, rozpływać, takie kilka strumieni, które myśmy już spotkali wcześniej i są dla nas ważne, i ten wątek pracy z lokalnością i z tymi narodowymi narracjami, zwłaszcza w kontekście dzisiejszego wspaniałego święta, którego Polacy myślący krytycznie się w gruncie rzeczy wstydzą, a ten nasz wstyd też jest bardzo postkolonialny. Jest ważne. Ja dzisiaj wspominałem też o wątkach takiej niebezpiecznej bałkanizacji, która nam może grozić, jeżeli nie będziemy rozmawiać w tym trójkącie ukraińsko-polsko-białoruskim, bo czasami w studiu sami i same odczuwamy napięcia i pewnego rodzaju brak języka. I chcemy się uczyć od siebie nawzajem, bo musimy się uczyć życia w świecie, który się zajebiście szybko zmienia i dostarcza nam właściwie bardzo dużo konfliktogennych pozycji i takich ognisk zapalnych, co do których musimy zajmować stanowisko, a brakuje nam czasami chyba jakichś, nie wiem, aktualnych perspektyw. Arek Półtorak zaproponował, żeby temu wszystkiemu, o czym dzisiaj mówimy, przyjrzeć się przede wszystkim z perspektywy dzisiaj. Nie? To dzisiaj jest tu i teraz, stream jest właśnie live, jest pewną taką też naszą formułą metodologiczną, odpowiedzią na to, jak pracować też dzisiaj z różnymi treściami, kiedy możemy się komunikować hybrydowo i współpracować też hybrydowo w ramach jakichś takich dłuższych procesów. My mamy też pewną historię jakichś takich naszych własnych doświadczeń tutaj ze studia. Są też dłuższe historie, jest niesamowita słowiańszczyzna Marianion. Są studia Janka Sowy, który był u nas w ramach Krakersa na jednym z efirów kilka miesięcy temu. No i jest to nasze dzisiejsze spotkanie, które mam nadzieję, że zaczyna coś długoterminowego. Bardzo Wam dziękuję, że jesteście tutaj z nami. Dziękuję wszystkim osobom, które ewentualnie nas teraz słuchają albo sobie to przesłuchają kiedyś tam, w innej teraźniejszości. No my co? Rozłączamy się i wracamy do lokalności. Jeżeli ktoś z Was chce jeszcze teraz właśnie coś dodać, to ten mikrofon oczywiście nie jest zawłaszczony przeze mnie, a raczej z takiego poczucia, że by nie robić dyskomfortu osobom, które nie chcą pracować dzisiaj z mikrofonem i w formule hybrydowej, dlatego rezygnujemy z dalszego streamingu. Dzięki.
Ja chciałbym powiedzieć kilka słów, nawiązując może na początku do tego, co mówiła Maria Teresa w tym naszym dialogu, któremu można było się przysłuchiwać online przez ostatnią godzinę. Maria Teresa mówiła tam między innymi o tym, że ważne jest to, jak się siedzi przy stole i kto siedzi przy tym stole, w jakiej kolejności, w jakim porządku. No i po co się w ogóle przy tym stole siada? My dzisiaj usiedliśmy między innymi po to, żeby wznieść toast z okazji Święta Niepodległości, którego wolałbym nie określać pełną nazwą, bo pełna jego nazwa to Narodowe Święto Niepodległości. Upamiętnia to święto rok 1918, kiedy Polska odzyskała niepodległość, ale no, chyba truizmem jest wręcz powiedzieć coś, co jednak było prawdą, że była to Rzeczpospolita wielonarodowa i wieloetniczna, a więc sprowadzanie tej dzisiejszej okazji do jakiegoś święta jednego narodu, jednej grupy jest chyba pewnym nadużyciem. My mamy to szczęście, że jesteśmy tutaj w bardzo zróżnicowanym gronie. Są tutaj artyści, akademicy, studenci z UJ-u, z ASP, przede wszystkim ludzie, którzy identyfikują się w rozmaity sposób jako Polacy, Łemkowie, Ukraińcy and beyond. Myślę, że tych tożsamości jest dużo więcej przy tym stole. Wszystkim wam dziękuję za to, że się tutaj zebraliście i zebraliśmy. Dziękuję przede wszystkim Olenie Kozakiewicz z Muzeum Etnograficznego w Krakowie i projektantce Annie Marii Zygmunt, które już tutaj dużo w ciągu ostatniej godziny opowiadały. Streszczę tylko krótko, o czym mówiliśmy. Mówiliśmy między innymi o wystawie z Muzeum Narodowego w Krakowie sprzed kilku lat, Polskie style narodowe. Wystawie, która śledziła, jak twierdzili kuratorzy, wykuwanie się właśnie jakiejś narodowej estetyki w latach przed odzyskaniem przez Polskę niepodległości, potwierdzając chyba jak gdyby, że ta nowa tożsamość nowo niepodległego kraju nie wzięła się jak gdyby z kapelusza. No ale jak wczytać się w tekst albo przyjrzeć się dokumentacji wystawy, no to okazuje się, że wszystko, co było prezentowane na tej wystawie, to była jakaś awangardowa czy protoawangardowa hybrydyzacja różnych tożsamości, do której jak gdyby prowizyjnie czy prowizorycznie przyklejano ten termin narodowy, oczywiście z pewnymi społecznymi konsekwencjami. Ale można by kuratorów pewnie wypytać o to, dlaczego akurat styl zakopiański, dlaczego huculszczyzna i to, jak ustaliliśmy jakaś specyficzna wersja huculszczyzny, tak? Czy kilka różnych jej wersji, które zostały ze sobą zespolone, tak? Wersji, dodajmy, zapośredniczonych przez już pewne pomysły artystów, rzemieślników, którzy wprowadzali swoje pracę na rynek komercyjny. Tak jak to dzisiaj robi Anna Maria Zygmunt, tylko chyba właśnie z zupełnie innych pobudek, tak? I inaczej wpisując się w pejzaż napięć czy relacji pomiędzy lokalnością i globalizacją, o których też kuratorzy wspomnianej wystawy pisali. Przyglądaliśmy się tego, co o huculszczyźnie pisał Osendowski albo i Kolberg, raz orientalizując, raz bałkanizując tę huculszczyznę. Tak? Dziewczęta w Chliboce nie ustępują pięknością dziewcząt na wyspach archipelagu greckiego. Czarnobrewe, czarnookie, istne słowiańskie rusałki. To też ciekawa hybryda albo brykolaż różnych elementów. No i chyba... Jak już mówimy o siedzeniu przy stole i o tym, co się tu dzieje, no to chyba warto podkreślić, jaki śmiech wzbudziła jeszcze końcówka cytatu, który mam przed sobą. Jest to kraj churysek, bo te rozkosznice, te psyche galateje, co chwila kręcąc, tak pociągają ku sobie, że chce się krzyczeć lub śpiewać donośnie ta na 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 na, ti ni 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 ni. Więc to ta na 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 ni, ta na na. Rozmawialiśmy o przejmowaniu i zawłaszczaniu. Moim zdaniem trzeba przejąć i zawłaszczyć to ta na, ni, skujrować to, zdekolonizować i zacząć tutaj też jakąś pracę hybrydyzacji, która po prostu ujawnia, a jednak użyję tego słowa ryzykownego, głupotę tej awangardowej czy protoawangardowej autentyczności, która często jest wpisana w podobne projekty, nie wiem, intelektualne, etnograficzne, czy quasi-etnograficzne, czy artystyczne. I to również dzisiaj. Rozmawialiśmy na przykład o Zakopanem dzisiaj, tak? I o księstwie góralskim, czyli o scypku ze szkła i stali, wewnątrz którego palą się szisze, tak? Na drewnianych stołach. Zanim Roman wszedł tutaj z mikrofonem, zaczęliśmy, szczególnie tutaj Anna Maria mówiła o tym, że posługując się tradycyjnymi technikami miksuje jak gdyby różne wzory, a więc też wprowadza ten element bricolażu, tak? Ale to chyba nie jest ten sam bricolaż, on czemuś innemu służy, więc myślę, że mamy tutaj dużo wątków jeszcze do poeksplorowania. Pewnie wszystkich nie wyczerpiemy dzisiaj, ale raz jeszcze dziękuję wszystkim zebranym. No i chętnie przekażę mikrofon, jeśli ktoś chciałby coś dodać.
Tak? Proszę.
No, tak. Tak, jedną rzecz, bo właśnie rozmawialiśmy o tym, jak ta kultura lokalna dzisiaj wygląda i też właśnie jak ten model z XIX wieku, tego etnografa, który przychodzi i odkrywa to coś innego, dalej właściwie gdzieś tam orbituje i właśnie rozmawialiśmy o paru wystawach i tak może zapomniałem nadmienić, ale jutro się kończy wystawa Włodzimierza Tetmajera w Muzeum Narodowym oddziale Pałac Krzysztofory. No i właśnie przyszedłem ostatnio i też jakby widzę po dzielnicy, w której się wychowywałem po Bronowicach, że też jakoś przeszły właśnie na ten, bardzo mocno wchodzą dalej na ten model narodowy. Tak, tylko tyle.
Tak, to ja przede wszystkim dziękuję też bardzo za zaproszenie. Jest to szalenie ciekawe doświadczenie i bardzo inspirująca wymiana myśli, a korzystając z tej okazji chciałabym zaprosić Was i Państwa na wystawę, która się zbliża w Etnocentrum w Krośnie. 7 grudnia będzie wernisaż. Wystawa Przestrzenie zewnętrzne i przestrzenie wewnętrzne, której kuratorem jest Michał Szymko. I to będzie wystawa właśnie artystów łemkowskich w Krośnie.
Dziękujemy. Ja jeszcze chciałem dodać, że stół jest na kółkach, co też może stać się metaforą, że to nie jest jakiś jeden stół statyczny, przy którym się spotykamy i już jest fajnie, że jesteśmy jakby z różnych perspektyw i wielojęzyczni i z różnymi jakimiś źródłami. Też jeżeli chodzi o metodologię i dyscypliny, z których bagażem przychodzimy. On jest na kółkach, on jest skrzynią, będziemy rozpakowywać różne wątki, łączyć ze sobą. Na stole też leży trochę jakichś źródeł, kontekstów, do których się możemy odwołać. Ja chciałem tylko przywołać jeden i trochę tak wspomnieć Anetę Szyłak, która zmarła kilka dni temu, kuratorka, organizatorka życia instytucjonalnego w Polsce i nie tylko w Polsce, pracująca bardzo dużo też z różnymi wątkami sztuki niezachodniej i z tym wszystkim, co w sztuce jest ważne społecznie, politycznie i na ile sztuka jest w stanie być takim miejscem do pracy i przepracowywania. I to jest katalog projektu, przy którym w 2004 roku pracowaliśmy wspólnie z Anetą Szyłak jako kuratorką, która zaprosiła Fundację 366, która wtedy się rodziła, działała wraz z ekipą Była tam Zorka Wolny, był Janek Simon, był Janek Sowa, byłem ja. I projekt odbywał się na ruinach Starego Miasta Kostrzynia, na granicy polsko-niemieckiej. Te ruiny do tej pory są ruinami, o ile wiem, bo jest to taki trochę wyrzut sumienia na tym polsko-niemieckim pograniczu pozostawiony trochę jako pomnik, a trochę jako rzeczywiście przestrzeń, z którą do końca lokalnie nie wiadomo było i nie wiadomo cały czas jakby co zrobić, czy to odbudowywać, kto, dla kogo, dlaczego, a jednocześnie jakby ten strach przed odbudową też jest tutaj gdzieś tam w tle. I myśmy zaproponowali wtedy projekt, który był nie tyle instalacją w przestrzeni, bo dużo raczej takich prac było, co procesem. Nazywało się to program imienia Edwarda Saida, który zmarł mniej więcej zmarł wtedy, kiedy myśmy zaczęli pracować nad tym projektem, kiedy dostaliśmy zaproszenie. I wydawało nam się, że to jest bardzo ciekawe, ważne i przydatne metodologicznie, to co Edward Said zaproponował w pracy z lokalnościami i w całej koncepcji studiów postkolonialnych. I w takim rozpoznaniu, jak bardzo narracje narodowe i narracje te właśnie centralistyczne antagonizują lokalności. I pracowaliśmy nad tym. Sam projekt został w procesie, nie był jakimś takim momentem spełnienia. Natomiast to, co wiele z nas robiło później, wydaje mi się, że miało takie ciekawe, taki zaczyn jakby tam. I to, co... I mam nadzieję, że dzisiaj też tak będzie, jakby dalej z tym, co robimy. No. Tak, taki zaczyn.
Ja chciałem jeszcze na sekundę przejąć mikrofon, żeby powiedzieć, że we wtorek wieczorem w ramach 55. Kongresu Międzynarodowego Stowarzyszenia Krytyków Sztuki AIKA, który będzie odbywał się teraz przez cały tydzień w Krakowie, wręczymy niestety pośmiertnie nagrodę dla wybitnej krytyczki Anecie Szyłak. Mieliśmy nadzieję, że Aneta dołączy do nas, ale tak się nie stanie i może ta pauza, to moje zawieszenie głosu niech teraz symbolicznie wybrzmi jako coś w rodzaju minuty ciszy. Zapraszam wszystkich Państwa też na kongres i między innymi tutaj do Stream Art Studio na Berka Joselewicza, bo zobaczymy się jeszcze w piątek o 19:00, żeby pewnie jakoś eksplorować dalej te wątki, podsumować też pewnie kończący się wtedy kongres. I jeszcze dla porządku chciałem zaznaczyć, że te cytaty, które tutaj wyczytywałem wcześniej, one zostały zebrane i opracowane i skomentowane w bardzo porządny i bardzo pożyteczny sposób przez Agnieszkę Jankowską-Marzec w książce Między sztuką a etnografią. Mam nadzieję, że Agnieszka wkrótce też do nas dołączy. Dzisiaj niestety nie mogła, ale jesteśmy w kontakcie, więc pozdrowienia dla Agnieszki.
Dzięki. Zostajemy lokalnie.